Before Rubis ever appeared in Kenya, before the rebranding, before KenolKobil disappeared, this was already a very specific kind of company. And if you don't understand that, then everything that happens later just looks like business as usual. Rubis was founded in France in 1990 by two investment professionals, Gilles Gobin and Jackie Riou. And these ones, they were just deal makers, not engineers, not oil drillers, not people coming from the traditional energy background. From the very beginning, the company was not built like Shell or BP. It was not trying to discover oil, and it was not even trying to dominate the upstream production. Rubis focused on something that most people overlook, the middle of the system. Storage, distribution, logistics, the parts of the oil business that are not glamorous, but control how fuel actually moves. And that decision changes everything. Because once you control storage terminals, depots, and distribution networks, you are no longer just another player in the market. You become part of the system that every other player depends on. Before Rubis was even fully formed, there was an early structure behind it in 1989, a venture linked to Jackie Riou and a French regional bank. This was built around LPG and fuel distribution using acquired storage assets. That early experiment, it proves something very important. You don't need to own oil fields to build power in this industry. You need to control movement. So when Rubis officially forms in 1990, that idea is already clear. They're not going to compete with the oil giants where those giants are strongest. They're going to move differently. Instead of building from scratch, they start acquiring. 1992, they merge with an investment company called Penhuet. In 1993, they acquire CPA, which is a major storage company in France. They are no longer small. Now they control real infrastructure. Then they move into LPG through Vitogas, then into new regions, then into new markets. And the pattern becomes obvious. Rubis does not enter empty space. It enters where something already exists. Then it takes it. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, they expand into Morocco, Madagascar, and the Caribbean. And they're not expanding by building hundreds of new stations from zero. They are expanding by acquiring existing systems and restructuring them. This is their model. Find undervalued or underoptimized assets, acquire them, standardize them, scale them, repeat. And because they're not tied to drilling or refining like traditional oil majors, they're more flexible. They can move faster, they can enter markets others are exiting, and they can take over operations that no longer fit into a multinational strategy and turn them into profit. That's how they grow. Quietly, consistently, and strategically. By the 2010s, Rubis is already operating across Europe, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. They're not loud, they're not flashy, but they're present and they're watching. Because when a company like that looks at a market like East Africa, it's not asking, how do we enter? It's asking, who do we buy? And by the time that question leads them to Kenya, the answer is already waiting. KenolKobil.
The Capital Markets Authority has launched investigations into suspicious trading of KenolKobil shares at the stock exchange. Now, the regulator says surveillance identified potential irregular trading on the counter in the run-up to the issue of notice of 100% takeover intention by French oil firm Rubis Energy. Rubis already owns 24.9% of the oil marketer and plans to purchase the remaining 75% stake if it receives regulatory approvals from the Capital Markets Authority. Rubis says it will pay 23 shillings a share for the remaining shares, valuing the offer at 23.4 billion shillings.
A full network, a full system, a company with history, infrastructure, and reach. Exactly the kind of target Rubis was built for. And when they finally move, they don't enter slowly, they take over completely. When you see a Rubis petrol station today, it feels like it has always been there. The branding is clean, the stations look established, and everything about it gives the impression of a company that built itself up slowly over time. But that is not what happened. Rubis did not come to Kenya to build. They came to take over a system that was already built, already tested, already struggling in some places and thriving in others. And to understand how that happened, you have to go all the way back to a time when petrol stations were not even the main business. In 1959, a company called Kenya Oil Company Limited. It was founded in Nairobi by a man called R.S. Alexander. At that time, Kenya was still under colonial rule, and the energy needs of households looked very different from today. Electricity was not widely available, so kerosene was not just a product. It was essential for daily life. That is where Kenol begins, with packaged kerosene sold under the brand name Safi. And even at that early stage, there's something very telling about the way the business is positioned. It's not just about selling fuel, it's about trust. Clean fuel, reliable fuel, and a name people can depend on inside their homes. Now this is why it gets interesting. Just a few months after it was founded, in September 1959, the company listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. That is not a small move. A business that is young, going public, tells you immediately that this was not meant to remain a small trading operation. There was ambition from the beginning, and there was already a network of investors willing to back it. From there, the company begins to expand beyond kerosene. It starts building service stations, then it slowly moves into the broader petroleum market, trying to compete with global names that are already established in Kenya at the time. Companies like Shell, BP, Esso, and Caltex. But this is where the reality of the oil business shows up. This is not a forgiving industry. You're dealing with global price movements, supply dependencies, foreign exchange pressures, and high operating costs. You need capital and you need scale. And if you don't have those, even a promising company can break. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, that pressure catches up with Kenol. The global oil environment becomes unstable, and the company is pushed into receivership. That is a moment where the business almost disappears completely. Now you have to understand that story because it explains everything that comes next. Kenol survives, but it learns a very hard lesson. It cannot operate alone in a market and remain stable. Survival will not come from trying to outcompete bigger players head-on. It will come from finding a way to become bigger, more efficient, and more connected. That shift in thinking opens the door for what comes next. Around the same period, another development is taking place in the Kenyan oil sector. A major international company, Kobil, it exits the market. When a company like that leaves, it does not just vanish. It leaves behind infrastructure, supply relationships, and market gaps. Those assets are picked up and restructured into a new identity. The name changes from Kobil to Kobil. On the surface, it looks like a simple rebranding, but structurally, it's something much deeper. The company is set up with an offshore component and becomes closely tied to supply arrangements in the region, including links to national oil supply systems. So now you have two different entities in the same market. Kenol, which has gone through collapse and recovery and is still trying to stabilize itself, and Kobil, which has emerged from an opportunity created by the exit of a multinational and is structured in a way that gives it access to supply and flexibility. They're different in origin, but they're both facing the same pressure. The market is competitive, margins are tight, and operating costs are high. Neither of them is strong enough on its own to dominate. So instead of competing directly, they start moving towards each other. In 1986, Kenol and Kobil enter into a joint operations and management agreement. They begin sharing distribution systems, management structures, and operational costs. It's a strategic decision to survive and grow in a market that does not reward fragmentation. Over time, that relationship deepens and becomes what people come to know as KenolKobil. And this is where the foundation of the modern network is actually built. Because from that point, the company is no longer thinking in terms of single locations or isolated operations. It's building a regional system. It's expanding into Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, and Zambia. It's also strengthening supply chains, it's increasing volumes, and it's spreading risk across multiple markets. By the 2000s and 2010s, KenolKobil is no longer a small Kenyan company. It's a regional player with real infrastructure, real distribution power, and a wide network of stations. And that's the key point. By the time you start seeing Rubis stations in Kenya, the system was already built. The locations were already secured, the supply chains were already running, and the customer base was already there. Rubis did not create that. They acquired it. And the way they did it, it was not random. It was calculated, timed, and very deliberate. Because while KenolKobil was expanding across East Africa, Rubis, on the other side, it was building a completely different kind of strategy. Not by starting from zero in new markets, but by waiting for the right moment, identifying strong existing players, and then taking them over in one move. So by the time Rubis finally enters East Africa in 2018 and 2019, they're not entering as a small new competitor. They're entering to replace an entire system with their own. And when that transition happens, it happens fast. Companies that had been known for decades, they begin to disappear from the forecourt. Kenol, Kobil, and Gulf, all replaced by one name, Rubis. By the time you get to 2018, KenolKobil is not a small company trying to survive anymore. It's established, it's listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange, it has operations across multiple countries, and it has hundreds of stations, supply contracts, storage, logistics, and relationships. From the outside, it looks stable, but inside the industry, there's a different conversation happening. Because scale alone is not enough anymore. The oil business is changing, margins are tightening, competition is increasing, Global players are restructuring. Capital requirements, they are getting heavier. And for a regional company like KenolKobil, that creates pressure. Not collapse pressure like the 1980s, strategic pressure. The kind that forces a decision. Do you keep fighting as you are, or do you become part of something bigger? At the same time, somewhere else, Rubis is watching. And Rubis is very specific about how it moves. It waits for the moment when a strong company becomes available. KenolKobil fits their profile perfectly. So in 2018, Rubis makes its move. I'm talking about a takeover, not a partnership. Through Rubis Energy, they begin acquiring shares in KenolKobil. And I'm telling you, this is control, not a slow accumulation for influence. By 2019, the deal is complete. KenolKobil is no longer an independent Kenyan company. It's now part of Rubis. And something very important happens immediately after. The company is delisted from the Nairobi Securities Exchange. Now that moment matters because it marks the end of a public Kenyan oil company that had existed since 1959. No more public shareholders, no more local listing. The company is now fully absorbed into a global system. But Rubis does not stop there because controlling KenolKobil gives them a strong foundation. But they want dominance. And to get that, they go after another key player, Gulf Energy. In December 2019, Rubis acquires Gulf Energy's downstream business in Kenya for around 16.4 billion shillings. Let's step back and look at what just happened. In 1 year, Rubis has taken over KenolKobil and then absorbed Gulf Energy. 2 major networks, 2 major systems, all combined under one structure. This is consolidation at scale, and the effect is immediate. Suddenly, Rubis is not a new entrant. It's one of the largest fuel players in Kenya. Hundreds of stations, massive storage capacity, regional reach across East Africa, existing supply chains. I mean, everything already in place. And this is why their strategy works. Because they don't spend years trying to build trust in a new market. They buy trust. They don't spend years looking for locations. They acquire locations that are already performing. They don't introduce themselves slowly. They arrive fully formed. Now, this is where it gets interesting. To the average customer, none of this feels dramatic. There's no big announcement that changes how people fuel their cars. There's no sudden shift in how stations operate. I mean, everything continues. Fuel is still available. Cars still come in. Transactions still happen. But behind that normal experience, ownership has changed. And that is the real move. Because in this industry, control does not need to be loud. It just needs to be complete. And by the end of 2019, Rubis had done just that. They now control one of the largest fuel networks in Kenya and across East Africa. And they did it without building it from zero. They stepped into a system that had taken decades to create and made it theirs in less than 2 years. Now comes the next phase. You can't run Kenol, Kobil, and Gulf all as separate identities. That creates confusion and that weakens the brand. So the next move is not about acquisition, it's about erasure. You know, replacement, standardization. This is where the name Rubis starts appearing everywhere. And once that process begins, the old names disappear faster than people expect. Once Rubis had control, the real work began. Taking over KenolKobil and Gulf Energy, that was the hard, expensive move. But ownership alone is not the end game. Ownership is just access. What matters is what you do with that access. Because now Rubis is sitting on something very complex. Hundreds of stations, different brands, different systems, different customer experiences, different internal cultures. Gosh, even different expectations from the people running those stations. You can't scale that kind of structure as it is. You have to unify it. And that's exactly what Rubis does next. But the way they do it is what makes it interesting. There is no dramatic announcement where everything changes overnight. There is no moment where the country stops and says, Kenol is gone, Kobil is gone, Gulf is gone. It doesn't happen like that. It happens quietly, gradually, then suddenly. Stations begin to change one by one. A canopy here, new colors there, and new signage replacing old logos. At first, you don't even register it. You just notice something looks different. You know, cleaner, more uniform. Then you start seeing the name more often. Rubis. Another station changes, then another, then another. And before you fully process what's happening, the old names that had been part of the Kenyan fuel industry for decades, they are disappearing. Kenol, Kobil, and Gulf. Names that had history, names that had survived collapse, partnerships, and expansion across East Africa. People grew up seeing these names on roads, in towns, and in estates. They are all replaced by one, Rubis. And this is not about branding, it's about control. Because once you standardize the brand, you standardize everything behind it. The way stations look, the way they operate, the safety protocols, the customer experience, and the systems running in the background. Rubis is not just repainting stations, it's aligning an entire network to its own model. By early 2021, the scale of this becomes clear. Over 200 stations are rebranded across Kenya. The process is moving fast, and it's deliberate. This is execution, not something like an experiment. And the message is simple. There is no more KenolKobil. There is no more Gulf Energy Network. There is just one system now, Rubis. But what makes this even more powerful is that while the outside is changing, the inside is also being restructured. The supply chains are tightened, the logistics are aligned, and the operations are brought under one standard. Health, safety, and environmental requirements, they are enforced at a group level, not left to local variation. At the same time, Rubis is not just thinking about fuel. Because if you remember, this company was never built as a traditional oil giant. It was built around distribution, efficiency, and extracting value from the system. So the stations begin to evolve. Shops are upgraded, layouts are improved, and non-fuel activities become more important. The station is no longer just a place where you stop, fuel, and leave. It becomes a small commercial hub. And this is where the strategy becomes very clear. Rubis did not come to Kenya to simply sell fuel under a new name. They came to optimize an existing system and make it work harder, more efficient, more standardized, and more profitable. And they do it fast. By 2022, more than 200 stations across the region, they're already operating under Rubis identity. In almost every major town, you can now find multiple Rubis stations. What used to be a mix of different brands has been compressed into one dominant presence. And the speed of that transformation is what most people usually miss, because it feels gradual when you live through it. But when you step back, you realize something very different. A network that took decades to build under different names was unified under one brand in just a few years. That is strategy. And now the real question shifts, because now Rubis has the network, they have the locations, and they have the brand. So the question is no longer how they got here. The question is how this system actually makes money. Because what you see at a petrol station is not where the real game is being played. By the time you see a fully rebranded Rubis station, everything looks settled. The structure is clean, the branding is consistent, and the operations feel smooth. From the outside, it looks like a finished system. But what you see on the surface is not where the real money is made. Let's start with the part everyone assumes is the business. Fuel. You drive in, you fuel, you pay, you leave. It feels like that transaction is the core of everything, you know? It feels like that's where the profit is coming from. It isn't. In Kenya, fuel prices are not freely set by the station. They are regulated by the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. Every month, prices are announced and stations are expected to operate within those limits. That means the station owner is not sitting there deciding how much profit to make per liter. That margin is already fixed. And it's small. Very small. When you break it down, a dealer is earning just a few shillings per liter. That small margin has to cover everything. Staff salaries, electricity, security, maintenance, equipment, losses. I mean, everything that keeps the station running. So immediately, the picture changes. This is a volume business. You only make money if you're moving large amounts of fuel consistently. That's why location matters so much. A station on a busy road in Nairobi, it can sell tens of thousands of liters in a day. That volume is what keeps the operation alive. But even then, fuel alone is not enough because the margin is just too thin. This is where the real strategy begins. Fuel is the entry point, not the product. It brings people in. Once they're in, the business shifts. Now let's look at how a Rubis station is structured. There is a forecourt where fuel is dispensed. That is what pulls the traffic. But the real attention is inside the station. The shop, the services, the small details that most people don't even think about. Inside that shop, the rules are different. Those products, they're not price regulated in the same way as fuel. The station has more control. Margins are higher, pricing can be adjusted, and promotions can be introduced. A bottle of water, a snack, a quick purchase on impulse, it can carry a higher percentage margin than several liters of fuel. Now let's expand that beyond the shop. Add a car wash, add lubricants, add LPG for cooking, add mobile money services, add small food outlets or coffee points. Each one carries better margins than fuel. And suddenly, the station is no longer just a fuel stop. It's a retail environment. It's a place designed to capture value from every person who enters, not just from the fuel they pump. And this is where the smartest operators separate themselves. Because two stations can sell the same fuel at the same price, under the same brand, on the same road, and perform completely different. One is just selling fuel, the other is converting traffic into spending. The difference is not the fuel, it's everything around it. Now something else that we don't usually think about, the fuel sitting underground. That fuel is not free. Before it's sold, it has already been paid for. That means millions of shillings are tied up in inventory sitting in those underground tanks. The dealer has to finance that stock. So when prices go up, it does not mean the station is making more money. It means more capital is locked in the ground. And when prices go up, it can get even worse. You might be forced to sell fuel at a lower price than what you bought it for. That is real risk. So now the dealer is not just managing sales. They are managing cash flow, stock timing, and price cycles at the same time. Now bring competition into the picture. Because that Rubis station, it's not alone. There's another station across the road and another one down the street. Same product, same regulated price. So how do you compete when you cannot change the price? You compete on experience, you compete on convenience, and you compete on what happens after the car stops. And this is where the Rubis strategy fits perfectly, because this company was never built around just selling fuel. It was built around controlling distribution and extracting value from the system. So when Rubis standardizes its stations, it's designing them to perform the same way, to attract traffic, to hold attention, to increase spending per customer, to turn every visit into more than just a fuel transaction. Now let's ask ourselves, what happens when everything goes wrong? Because this business, as clean as it looks on the surface, it has pressure. Real pressure. There's financial pressure, there's political pressure, and there's operational pressure. By the time you understand how a Rubis station works, it's very easy to assume that the system is stable. Everything looks controlled, structured, and predictable. Fuel comes in, cars come in, and money flows out. But that stability is only on the surface. Underneath, this business is constantly under pressure. And not from one place, from multiple directions at the same time. There's financial pressure, operational pressure, legal pressure, and political pressure. And when those pressures hit, that is when you start seeing how the company actually operates. Let's start with something that most people would never notice: data. After Rubis completed the acquisition of KenolKobil and took over Gulf Energy's downstream business in 2019, they did not just inherit stations and supply contracts. They inherited systems, servers, records, and transaction data. And that is where a problem emerged. Before handing over, Gulf Energy had prepared new systems, and according to reports, some data had been deleted or formatted. Rubis then carried out forensic data recovery on those systems and came to a conclusion that the transaction values they had acquired, they might have been overstated. That immediately turns into a dispute. And I'm talking about a technical legal fight, because now you're dealing with questions of valuation, data ownership, and whether what was presented before the acquisition, whether it matches what actually existed. And this tells you something very important about how Rubis operates. This company does not just acquire and move on. It audits, it verifies, it challenges. And if something does not add up, it pushes back. Now let's move from the data to contracts. In Kenya, Rubis won a major deal to supply diesel to off-grid power stations under Kenya Power. We are talking about tens of millions of liters, billions of shillings in value. The kind of contract that strengthens your position in the market. Then, everything changes. In January 2023, the Procurement Tribunal cancels that deal. That deal was cancelled because of a procedural issue. Another bidder had been locked out of the system for a short window before submission. That's enough. The deal is nullified. Now let's think about what that means in real terms. Planning has already been done, supply lines have already been considered, capital has already been allocated. And just like that, the contract disappears. Rubis does not walk away quietly. They go to court, they challenge the decision, and they argue procedural flaws. But in March 2023, the court refuses to overturn the ruling. The deal is gone. And just like that, a major expected revenue stream disappears. That is a financial shock. And it shows you how exposed this business can be to the regulatory processes that are completely outside of the company's control. Now, not all pressures come from the contracts. Some pressures happen on the ground. In one case, Rubis takes legal action against a transporter over fuel losses. The losses were worth hundreds of millions of shillings. An audit reveals discrepancies between what should be in storage and what is actually there. Fuel is disappearing, and it's not disappearing through a big dramatic theft or something like that. It's disappearing through inconsistencies, leakages, system failures, or something else entirely. And again, Rubis does not absorb the loss quietly. It goes to court. Because in a business where margins are already thin, Losses like that are not small problems. They are serious. And this pressure is not just local. In the Cayman Islands, a fuel tank leak, it leads to regulatory action. Authorities conclude that reasonable precautions were not fully taken. Legal proceedings follow. In Senegal, an incident at a terminal tests the company's emergency response systems. In Rwanda, depot upgrade projects, they face delays due to financial constraints, poor coordination, and project management challenges. Different countries, different situations, same pattern. This is a business that looks smooth on the outside, but internally, it's constantly managing risk. Operational risk, financial risk, and regulatory risk. And this is where the image of a clean, controlled system starts to change. Because what you're actually looking at is not a perfectly stable machine. It's a system that is always being adjusted. Always being corrected, always being defended. Let's talk about reputation, because in this industry, trust is not optional. If customers lose trust, traffic drops. If traffic drops, volume drops. If volume drops, the entire model starts to weaken. And reputation, it is shaped by everything. Contracts, legal disputes, public perception, and government relationships. Every move feeds into how the brand is seen. So Rubis is also managing perception. Because the last thing a company like this wants is to look unstable. By the time Rubis has fully established itself in Kenya, it's one of the dominant players. It controls a large network of stations, it has supply chains across the region, and it has operational systems that are already integrated. From a business perspective, it's in a strong position. But in Kenya, the oil sector is not just about business, it's also about the states. And at the center of that is the National Oil Corporation. Now, National Oil is a government entity. It's supposed to play a strategic role in ensuring fuel access, stability, and national participation in the energy sector. But over time, like many state corporations, it struggles. There is financial pressure, operational inefficiencies, debt, and underperforming assets. The kind of problems that don't collapse a company overnight, but slowly weaken it. So the government starts looking for a solution, a partnership. And this is where Rubis comes in. Because from the outside, this looks like a logical match. You have a company with infrastructure, systems, and efficiency. And you have a state corporation that needs capital, structure, and operational strength. So a deal is proposed. Rubis commits billions of shillings into National Oil. Part of it goes into working capital, part of it goes into upgrading stations, expanding the network, and improving operations. In return, the structure allows Rubis to recover its investment over time through a share of fuel sales. On paper, it looks clean. A rescue, a partnership, a win for both sides. But this is where things stop being simple. Because once you move into state-linked deals, you're no longer just dealing with the numbers. You're dealing with perception. And perception, it can change everything. Almost immediately, questions begin to come up. How exactly is this deal structured? What happens if National Oil cannot meet expectations? Who really benefits in the long term? And then the phrase that changes the entire tone of the conversation appears. Debt trap. Members of parliament, they begin raising concerns that the structure could put National Oil in a position where it can't recover, where the obligations become too heavy, and where control of key assets could quietly shift. Now the conversation is no longer about efficiency, it's about sovereignty. It's about whether a strategic national asset is slowly being handed over through a commercial agreement. And once that conversation starts, everything slows down. Parliament steps in, committee begin investigations, audits are ordered, and implementation is paused. What was presented as a solution, it becomes a subject of scrutiny. And this is where you see the other side of Rubis. Because in moments like this, the company does not go loud. It does not jump into public battles. It does not even try to dominate the narrative in the media. It steps back. It lets the process play out through institutions, the regulators, parliament, and oversight bodies. At the same time, behind the scenes, approvals are still being pursued. Regulatory exemptions are requested, legal frameworks are adjusted, and slowly, the deal finds its way forward again. By 2026, the Competition Authority extends approval for the partnership, allowing it to continue under defined conditions. So from a regulatory perspective, the deal stands, but the tension never fully disappears. This situation shows us how a company like Rubis operates when it steps into a space where business meets government. Where efficiency meets politics, where strategy meets national interest. And in that space, the rules are different. You're managing perception, power, and trust at a national level. By now, you can see the full shape of the system. This is a company that understood exactly where to position itself. It waited for the right moment and then moved with precision. It acquired infrastructure that took decades to build, unified it in a few years, and embedded itself deeply into the way fuel moves across the country and the region. Now, everything you've seen so far is based on one foundation: fuel. And that foundation, it's starting to shift. And it's not shifting dramatically. If you drive around Nairobi today, everything still looks normal. Stations are busy, cars are fueling, and the system is still moving. But underneath, the direction is changing. Governments are starting to think about cleaner energy. The cities, they're trying to think about the emissions. And global pressure around climate is increasing. Companies that are built on oil and gas, they're being forced to answer a very uncomfortable question. What happens when the world needs less of what you sell? Rubis is not immune to that question, and we can see how it's already responding. The company has started moving into renewable energy, investing in solar through platforms like Petrol, and positioning itself beyond just petroleum distribution. It's not abandoning fuel because the demand is still there, especially in markets like East Africa, but it's preparing for a future where fuel is not the only pillar. And that shift, it has consequences all the way down to the station. Because the traditional model is built around speed. You drive in, you fuel in a few minutes, and then you leave. But the new energy systems, they don't behave the same way. If electric vehicles grow, charging takes longer. If customers stay longer, the station has to change. It can no longer just be a quick stop. It becomes a place where people spend time. And once that happens, everything that we talked about earlier, it becomes even more important. The shop, it's no longer secondary, it becomes central. Food, seating, services, retail, all of it expands. The station starts looking less like a fuel point and more like a small commercial center. Here in East Africa, the transition will be slower. Fuel demand is still strong, and infrastructure for alternatives, it's still developing. The economics are different from Europe or China. So for now, the system holds. But the pressure is still there, and Rubis knows that. But the company was built to adapt, from storage to distribution, from one region to another, from one business model to the next. This is just Catalina, and I'll see you guys in the next breakdown. If you want to support the channel, the till is right here. Just support, it helps with the editing. The editor also needs to get something small. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next breakdown.